These stories are quite rare. I mean, they're common, but we don't know about them. So I suppose it was a little window into a small aspect of a global event, and the actual real people that were part of that happened to be caught up in that moment. And I found that the script was very precise, very clear, and I thought the voices were very distinct. It was a live unfolding event, tragedy, and it was being shot live and broadcast live. So that's pivotal. Yeah, that's a pivotal moment, and it's also something that you can't, it's a Pandora's box moment, I guess. You can't go back. In our movie, what's going on in that world? The Olympics take second seat to the ongoing live terrorist situation where terrorists have overtaken the Israeli Olympic Village athletes' house and have taken some Israeli athletes hostage. And so the fundamental decision in this room is, can we cover it live? And if so, how do we do it? And if we do it, then what if something really bad happens and we're shooting it, it's being broadcast live? That's the fundamental question, I think. That's one that my character, Marvin Bader, asks of Roone Arledge. Roone Arledge doesn't feel necessarily that he has a responsibility to that. His responsibility is to shoot it. And I think there's an argument for both sides. There's a fundamental question which arose for the very first time, you know, in Munich, 1972, which is, oh, well, it's on TV, so I believe it, right? We're living with that exponentially increased now, to the point where it's affecting our realities massively, massively, people's consciousness. No one has an agreed, sorry, it's just a high horse of mine right now. Like, we don't have shared objective facts. I just don't see what our future is. Everybody in it was amazing, I think, and it's one of those rare times that's the case, you know, where everybody has a life. You recognize each person instinctively. You know that they're authentic and true. It was like doing theatre with cameras, you know. Everybody's there to support one another because you're all out there together. It was fun, you know. We had fun together. You got to have fun in a tiny, small room like that. Tim was great. Tim was so prepared. Like, it puts me to shame, you know, like the amount of work and research that he'd done on it by the time I came along. I could have, you know, you felt in very safe hands. I wanted to do it from reading it and from the actors involved, but yeah, you knew straight away that you were with somebody who was going to make this authentic and realistic, realistic to the extent that the story deserves, you know. I suppose that if I had a hope about the film, it would be just that people think about what live coverage can do, what it means. That is it enough just to shoot something, cover it, and just let the audience decide, or do the people covering it have a responsibility? And more importantly, to what degree does that coverage affect the real world outcome of the event that you're covering? And I think there's no doubt that it does.
My name is Jeff Mason, and I was the coordinating producer for ABC's coverage of the Olympic Games in Munich in 1972. The ABC control room at the Olympics in Munich was a highly complex situation where 24 of us worked in perfect harmony together in order to present the best possible coverage of the Olympics. There were, as I say, over 24 of us that had to work together, much like a football side would have to work together in order to score a goal. Our mission was to work as closely together within the framework of this highly technically complex situation, room, in order to present the most effective and the most comprehensive coverage. That was 50 years ago. Now the control rooms are smaller than they were then, and there are fewer people because the technological advances that have been made don't require quite as many people. But in Munich, we all had to work very hard and very closely together in order to maximize the value of our presentation. Roone's mantra to those of us who worked with him was to tell stories about people. He understood better than anybody that every sporting event of substance is fashioned by people, by athletes, by officials, by whomever. But that sports coverage for Roone was essentially storytelling at its very highest about people. Those of us who worked closely with him understood that, and we all were directed, we were all focused in that direction in order to help him help us tell the stories of people that we knew he wanted to present. So we were focused on people and the stories about people, much more so than any other element of the sports event per se. And those of us who worked closely with him for many Olympics, I worked 5, 6 Olympics with Roone, we all had a very good sense of what he wanted because we had experience with him and we were very closely aligned with his vision. Marvin Bader and I covered 5 or 6 Olympics together. We were absolutely joined at the hip. I was in charge of preparing the ABC team for production, for producing the content of the Olympics. Marvin was in charge of organizing the technical and operational elements of the coverage, and he was also in charge of the budgetary elements of the coverage. So there wasn't any element of Olympic presentation that he and I did not have to communicate to each other about. And together we were able to put together a developmental plan that seemed to be successful. And we both worked for Roone Arledge in order to bring to life his vision. On that fateful day, I knew we were in for a very long, difficult day. So I began to think in my own mind what the priorities would be in terms of arranging for coverage of that story, and primarily trying to organize whom I thought Roone would want involved in the telling of that story. So it was troubling, it was stressful, but the job ahead was so overwhelming that I didn't really have time to think about anything but what we needed to do and whom we needed to call to get involved. At the age of 32, I knew that this probably would develop into one of the most important assignments I ever would have had. Yes, the Olympic Games themselves were a big assignment, but what was happening before our very eyes at a relatively young age occurred to me that we were in for some very stressful and important assignments. We began to understand that there were people, perhaps even families of the hostages in the U.S., that would be watching our coverage, watching the story unfold live. And we began to understand that the responsibility we had for being honest, truthful, and thorough in our coverage was more than any of us had ever imagined before. That turned out to be true. Families of the hostages were indeed watching our coverage and seeing the story unfold in their living rooms live. So we began to truly understand the impact of what we were doing. And when the security people told us to turn the camera off from the tower overlooking the roof of Building 31, That's when we really started thinking, we got to be really careful here, because what we're covering can be seen by everybody, basically in the world. And so that generated a higher sense of responsibility for what we were doing than we were used to. But our instincts were right, as we had been taught by Arledge year after year after year, and for several big events and Olympics. Just be truthful, be accurate, and do the right thing. And that's what we did. There was some discussion at some point, several hours into our coverage, about whether or not ABC News should take over the coverage of this event. And Roone basically said, there's not a chance that they'll be able to report on this event to the extent that we can. We have dozens and dozens and dozens of people who are focused on this coverage. The event is happening 100 yards away. ABC News people in New York are not going to be able to bring coverage to this awful event to the extent that we can do it. So he basically said, thank you for your offer, but we got it. The sense about that day that I am left with to this day is enormous pride in the accomplishment, but maybe more so than that, a complete confidence in how we followed our instincts that day to do the right thing. Yes, Roone Arledge was our boss, and he drove the coverage. But there were thousands of other little ancillary events and situations surrounding the central theme of our coverage that needed to be executed by a wide range of television professionals on our team. And the way we executed all those thousands of other little mini stories to this day makes me proud that all the preparation that we had going into Munich, not ever realizing we would ever have to utilize some of those instincts, they came good, and we did the right thing. And we followed our instincts, and we did it well, and about that I will have enduring pride. I think our entire industry, not just ABC in Munich, I think our entire industry learned something from that day in Munich. We stood on the shoulders of Jim McKay and Roone Arledge. And we covered that event, in my opinion, as intelligently and as honestly as it could be covered. None of us had any idea that we were going to have to reach down so far into our breadth of experience and emotion in order to tell that story. So I think our entire industry now understands better the responsibility of covering anything that happens in front of us live. That's the key. Television sports is, generally speaking, covered live. And I think today we all understand better that anything can happen and we have to be prepared. When I was approached with the idea of telling the story of September 5th via the perspective of the ABC television coverage of that event, I was very impressed by the depth of research that had been accorded the project, but more importantly, after I read the first two versions of the script, I was impressed by how deeply personal the experience was, not only to those of us involved in the production, but in telling the story of what happened that day. I was worried that it was going to be another documentary recitation of the facts. But I found, to my great good feeling, this project is a story about people and how we all reacted to what was happening in front of us. I am blessed to be one of the very few people who can still be around to tell that story through my eyes. Most of the people in the control room that day are no longer with us. So for me to be able to help tell a story through the eyes and the hearts of those of us that were there that day is a unique opportunity. I think the approach that this project has taken and the depth of understanding, not only about what happened that day, but who was involved in that story, gives it a unique opportunity to succeed when other projects might not. This is the true telling of what happened on September 5th through the focused eyes, ears, and hearts of a small group of us who were literally 100 yards away and who had a depth of connection to the development and the evolution of the big story through our electronic technology to tell the story the right way. I'm confident that that's what we're doing.
My name is Hansjörg Weißbrich, and I'm the editor of September 5. We wanted to create a kinetic experience for the audience. We wanted to create a riveting journalistic thriller, and given the fact that the film takes place entirely in a studio environment, we actually never leave. It was a great challenge to get the atmosphere lively and the atmosphere tense and riveting. The decision to tell the film from the unique perspective of the sports reporters team came when Tim and his co-author Moritz were working on the script. They originally had planned a multi-perspective film about the events, but ultimately decided to focus on entirely on the perspective of the news reporters team, and that it was when they met Geoffrey Mason, the real Geoffrey Mason. They contacted him as a source for the script, and then he became the source of the script because it's basically his story and his memory of the things that makes the film unique. For the editing, of course, it was a challenge to deal with people sitting in a room staring at a monitor wall. So it was important for us to not tell it in a static way, but tell it very dynamic and kinetic and high-paced, and focus on the characters, on the atmosphere in the room. And we had the opportunity to use the monitors as a window to the outside world. And I would assume that the audience don't really have the feeling that they stay in the room with the journalists, but have also a sense for what is happening outside through what we show on the monitors and on the film footage they are actually shooting on 16 millimeters. We wanted the film to be high-paced, to be to allow the audience to be in the situation like our leading characters, to feel the atmosphere in the room, to create a physical experience, and together with the camera work of our DOP, like the documentary style, they shot the film, and the combination with the archive footage, that were I think the biggest challenges in editing. And I worked very closely with Tim. He's very hands-on in the project and spent a lot of time discussing the cut with me. We just wanted to make sure the pace is exactly what we wanted it to be, and also in the balance with the emotional moments of the film. So the overall feeling is dynamic.
When I first read the script, I didn't necessarily see it as a thriller, but I saw it as an important piece of history and a page turner for me as an actor. And on top of that, the challenge of playing Geoffrey Mason, who's this young producer trying to make his way in this industry and deciding whether he should go for the scoop and sacrifice some of his principles or stay true to his journalist integrity and be a bit more cautious was intriguing to me. That push and pull, that internal struggle was really rich, and it drew me to the script. Actors by nature are competitive, and I think journalists by nature are competitive, especially if you're young and you want to make your mark and succeed and advance your career. You really are bright-eyed and at times green, but eager to do the job the best way possible. Talking to Geoffrey Mason, it became abundantly clear that when he was a young man on the ground there in Munich, he was going to focus and do the best job he possibly could do just in the telling of the sport so he could advance his career further. What I learned mostly from my conversations with him was that once the clock starts going in that control room, there's no time to stop, there's no time to think, there's no time for emotions. You do your job, you are a professional, and you do it right. It's not until after that you let the emotion and the actual tragedy wash over you. And Geoffrey told me something that was really meaningful to me, and it sort of gave me a place to start as I explored the role. He said, we had no time to think in that room on that day. It wasn't until after, when Marvin and I went back to the hotel and shared a drink, that we let ourselves cry and the tragedy washed over us. And I still, in the conversations I had with Jeff, I still feel that scar on him, and I still see a man coming to terms with the events of that day. I hope through this film he finds even more closure on that chapter in his life. This day forever changed media. This was the first time that a horrible event like this was shared globally via satellite on live TV. And it was innovative at the time. There was such excitement around the opportunity to broadcast live globally at the '72 Olympics, and having that taken over by these tragic events changed media forever. It's still something that we're grappling with, and I hope at the end of the day people realize that on September 5th, news was changed forever. A lot of people are familiar with the events on September 5, but all the stories that have come out, whether it's documentaries or television specials or films, have covered a much more broad story. A story of the Olympics at the time, of the response after, which is the film Munich, but no one has focused like a microscope on the news telling of that day. And September 5 offers that. It offers a peek into that control room as the events unfolded over those hours, and a unique perspective of how media covers these kinds of events. There were conversations about, can we show someone being shot on live television? These were decisions that they had to make. The decision to roll out the camera because they were 100 yards away was a decision that Geoffrey and the crew made. And it was just necessity was the mother of an invention at that time, and they had to do these things to keep telling the story, Most people don't know Geoffrey Mason or his mannerisms or how he is. So that was liberating in a way. I didn't feel like I had to imitate him. And sometimes when you play real people, that's the biggest challenge, because oftentimes you're imitating and you're going to be compared to them, and it's a really difficult task as an actor. Not having that pressure really allowed me to focus on the storytelling and come into it with my own perspective. And what was most important to me was capturing what Geoffrey was going through on that day, the challenges and struggles he was going through, and staying focused and keeping the ship afloat. That was my primary goal. And I think by focusing on that instead of trying to be Jeff Mason, actually does more service to his actual story in the telling of it. We have Roone, who's played by Peter Sarsgaard, who is a broadcast legend. He went on to, he created Wide World of Sports. He changed the way sports broadcasting existed. He created stories within the sporting events where you had heroes and you had villains, and it gave you something to root for. And he certainly was applying it in the situation that happened in Munich that day. Then you have Marvin, who's kind of this old school journalist who is true to his ethics and is very cautious and sort of the voice of reason in the whole situation. You have Geoffrey, who is this young, ambitious producer who's caught in between this struggle. And then you have Marianne, played by the wonderful Leonie Benesch, who offers what the new generation of German citizens were going through at the time, trying to recover from the horrors of the Holocaust, trying to recover from the 36 Olympics, which was used for Nazi propaganda, trying to present a fresh face of Germany to the world, and everything going horribly wrong. And Leonie delivers a sensitive and striking performance in that character. We also had an amazing other supporting cast members, including our background actors, who were really part of the ensemble. They were there every day, and that's not often the case. We had background actors who were there every day, who were given lines, who rose to the challenge to make this film as special as it could be. Tim, as our writer and director, offers a very Swiss perspective, and it may sound strange, but it's like a Swiss watch. He's so precise, he's so laser focused, and he knows exactly what he's going for. He made it very clear in our first conversations that he wanted this to feel as authentic and as honest as possible, and he really gave us the stage to play it that way. And that goes to our production designers, who created this amazing set that had working equipment from the period that we could use, that was tactile and just rich in texture. And that was all because of Tim's focus and his research and his study, and his ability on the day to let his actors be free. Sometimes you have a camera crew that doesn't feel like they're dancing with you. Markus was constantly dancing with us, and he gave us the room to do what we needed to do while still capturing exactly what he wanted to do. And I think that was in conversations with Tim and him, Markus and Tim, figuring out that they wanted this to feel almost like it was a documentary crew who was in the room filming it. So it gave us the room to just play the scenes and focus on that instead of worrying about hitting marks, worrying about hitting lights. But also his lighting of it, we had such control of that room because it was a stage, and so much preparation was put into the lighting of it that they were easily able to pivot with the actors' movements. I don't necessarily think it has to be contained for it to be thrilling. And in fact, I think there was a worry among us that, are we going to be able to captivate the audience for the entirety of the film if it's just in one location? It's almost more theatrical. You know, this could be a play on Broadway. So keeping that tension alive when you're just in one space is a huge challenge. But that speaks to the bravery of Tim as a storyteller, that he felt confident that he was going to be able to keep it as thrilling as possible in a limited location. For me as an actor, because the production design was so on point and so fantastic, it just transported me right back into 1972, using equipment that worked with with actual footage of Jim McKay on multiple TVs, and headsets that were from the era, and televisions and phones and buttons and everything. It just made every day stepping onto set so much easier because it felt so authentic. What I hope for this film is that people will go into it with fresh eyes, without preconceived notions, leave their thoughts about what it is behind, and go into it and watch it, and maybe walk out of it thinking about how they consume news, how we consume news collectively as a nation in the present. If people can start having those discussions, because news has become so polarized and it continues to push us away, and the idea that now we so cavalierly show violence on television daily, does that make us better informed? Does that make us better citizens? Or is it pushing us further apart? And I think that's a question Tim wants people to ask each other. I don't think we have an answer for it, but I hope people will go into it with a clean slate and walk out of it asking those questions.
September 5 is really cool in that it starts out feeling sort of like a newsroom drama and very quickly pivots to becoming this pressure cooker thriller. It's very heart-pounding. You find yourself in the seats of the people inside of that control room, having to make these difficult decisions in real time. We came onto the project fairly early in the development process. There had been a draft or two, and they had just started to toy with the idea of incorporating some of this archival footage. You know, what's really interesting about the film, there's so much archival footage interwoven, and all of it is there in the page. Moritz and Tim really carefully designed how all of that dramatic tension plays against the footage that existed. We knew that we wanted the film to have a feeling of authenticity and of urgency. We wanted it to feel real in the sense that for an audience to put themselves in the place of these journalists, we wanted to make sure that what was happening in the archival footage was playing against the reality, you know, that we were depicting inside of the control room. The 1972 Olympics in Munich were sort of this watershed moment. It was the first time that the Olympics were going to be broadcast live around the world. It was a sensational success up until September 5. We had Olga Korbut, you know, dazzling everyone. Mark Spitz, the day before, had won his 7th record gold medal. So everybody, it was this moment where not only did the news media feel like they were evolving into this next level of storytelling, but people at home suddenly had an appetite and an interest in watching things as they were happening. This was an Olympics that was being told live for the first time around the world, and leading into the crisis that ended up unfolding, it was sort of the perfect storm. We had cameras everywhere. There were satellites in the sky showing every household in the world. Nearly 1 billion people were watching this broadcast as it was happening. So it ended up just being this moment where everything sort of changed forever. The film raises a lot of ethical questions and moral questions. The people that were in the control room that day were trained professionals. They you know, career-long reporters and journalists, so it's not as though they weren't prepared to tell an excellent story. But I don't think, whether they were in sports or in news, nobody had any sense of what the implications of some of these things were. This was the first time that a story was being told at this scale. Certainly the first time that a crisis of this magnitude was being told live and in real time. So a lot of questions come up when you're doing this, no matter what your level of training is. And I think a lot of these questions we're still grappling with today. The questions include, you know, how soon do we tell the story? How many sources do we need to verify that it's accurate? Does it matter that it's fully accurate? It's really interesting in our 4 main characters because we sort of have the brains, we have the muscle, and we have the heart. You know, Roone, I think, really serves as the brain of the operation. He's sort of masterminding, you know, how all of this is going to go down and making sure that all the pieces are in place to ensure that it keeps going. Jeff and Marianne are sort of interesting, and they share the role of the muscle in a way. You know, they're both there to kind of keep things moving as they go through. Jeff certainly has his own investment here. You know, this is his chance to show off to the big boss what he can do. You know, it could be a career-making moment, certainly not at the magnitude that it ended up becoming. And Mariana's there, I think, just to do a good job. And she shares, I think, a little bit with Marvin Bader, and that they're both grappling with these questions of conscience, morality, and ethics. You know, Marvin is constantly challenging everyone and making sure that they're moving through the work that they're doing in a way that is ethically sound. Marianne is bringing her own history, you know, the history of Germany and the new generation who is trying to shed, you know, the past shame that they had coming out of World War II. And so even as she's moving through all of these things, trying to do the best job that she can, she herself is grappling, you know, with the reckoning, I think, that everybody in Germany was reckoning with in that moment. When Tim came to us, you know, as a writer and director of this project, there was certainly development to be done with the project, as there is with any project, but one thing was always obvious, that Tim was a force of nature. The passion that he has for detail, the passion that he has for not only storytelling, but research and authenticity to make sure that not only that the historical accuracy is there, but also that the emotional reality is there. Tim's a unique director in that way, that he's always thinking through all the way to the end, to the people that are going to be watching the movie at the end of the day. And he wants to make sure, of course, that they're entertained, and of course that they feel something, but also that they're thinking. And this was evident to us, you know, from the first page of the script all the way through, you know, Tim's guidance as director through production and post. Geoffrey Mason's a broadcast legend. You know, he came up under the tutelage of Roone Arledge. He's one of the only living members of that control room, you know, today. He was an incredible collaborator to us on the film, not only through our research, but he became a co-producer and really helped us make sure that the heart of the story that we were telling remained true to the experience of the people in that room and the history of what happened in that day. Roone is played very brilliantly by Peter Sarsgaard, who's one of my favorite actors, and I think is one of these actors that's been doing incredible work for us such a long time. We were so excited and lucky to have him on board. Peter brings this incredible thoughtfulness and intensity to the role. He has a lot of great lines in the movie, but I think the really incredible work that you see is watching him maneuver and listen and react as he moves through all of these situations. John Magaro brings this incredible quiet electricity to the role of Geoffrey Mason. You can see him wanting to impress his boss and wanting to do a good job, also feeling that he's got it, he can do it, and also kind of struggling through all of these ethical and moral decisions. Are we doing the right thing? By the time you get to the end of the film, you really feel that the Jeff character is the conscience of this film, that he is the heart of journalism as a concept and as journalists, as a larger body of people reporting information. The character of Jeff, as played by John, comes off as very relatable. You know, I think we can all see a little bit of ourselves in that. The person who's maybe in a little over our head, but who has confidence in themselves that they can still do a good job. It's very American in that way, this sort of bootstraps mentality. You know, John brings this incredible, complex portrayal of pathos, confidence, but also grappling with, have I done the right thing at the end of the day? I think it's a really tough chord to strike, and John hits a home run here. Marvin Bader was there as the head of operations for ABC Sports in real life and in our movie. He's played by Ben Chaplin. Ben brought to the role of Marvin this incredible layer upon layer of sensitivity and nuance, where we watched the character Marvin move through all these instances, making sure that everybody had the tools that they needed and the information that they needed, but also that they were minding their heart. I don't know that anyone could have brought to that specific balance of authority and heart that Ben brings to this role. Marianne is the German translator played by Leonie Benesch, and Leonie's an incredible actor. Marianne sort of serves as our portal to a more contemporary perspective. She's certainly representing what at that time was the German reckoning with what had happened. But I think when audiences today look at it, she's the character played very brilliantly by Leonie that we're able to connect with in a way, that we're able to see a little bit of what we've learned since these events have happened through the eyes of someone who at that time was coming to all of this with fresh eyes and wanting to sort of do better. It was really important to us that as you watched this movie, you felt a sense of authenticity, that these felt like real people doing real work. And because we were intercutting the original archival footage along with some recreated footage, and along with the story that we were telling inside of that newsroom, we knew that it needed to blend seamlessly. And it was important to us that even as we were telling a story of what had happened, in an entertaining way, that we had the footage that they were making for people to see with their own eyes and to see 50 plus years later just how impactful that footage still is right now. That the visceral feeling that you have as you watch some of these things unfold in real time. It was a moment that changed everything. But even as you watch it now, we knew that nothing that we could recreate could ever deliver with the electricity that was crackling through every frame that they captured there on the ground that day. I hope first and foremost that people are entertained and get to enjoy a really good story well told. I also hope that people are allowed to ask themselves some of the very important questions, the good, the bad, and the ugly of what it means to have information told to us live and in real time, and our demand for that information, whether it's true or not. I hope that people leave the film, asking themselves some of these very, very important questions.
For Tim, it was very crucial to tell the story as authentic as possible. And I remember when he came to me after reading the script, and he said to me, because we know each other from movies before, and he said, Julian, I know you like to take a lot of creative license, and I know you like to build your own worlds, but please, for once, could you just be as realistic and authentic as possible? And I was very happy to do so. From a designer's perspective, there have been two challenges. First of all, we wanted to create a world that is very authentic and tangible. And looking at the Olympic Village and all the event, this was a big stage. So the Olympic Village itself became a big stage. And at the same time, we had to tell the entire story inside a small world of a studio. My biggest concern was to find the right balance between a realistic approach and a creative license, that I, as a designer, need to visualize the drama and the emotions and the insights of the characters. And Tim was very, for him the realistic aspect was of course very important. And as I'm coming more from a fictional side, we needed to find a good way in between and the right balance. The research we did was really intense. I started to collect all kind of images around the Olympic Games from that time. And it was sometimes really difficult to differentiate between the Olympics in the 70s and the 80s, because all these control rooms looked very identical. And there were only small technical tools, screens that were different. And we had to be very careful with this, because, as I said, for Tim it was very important to be really accurate. Everything had to work, every button, every screen, everything needed to be on the right place, used by the right person, at the right time, and he wanted to have a response. If someone pushed the button, something had to happen. So we were collecting all kind of props from that era, all kind of machines, and we assembled it and brought it together in the studio. We wanted to create a set where we can move freely, where we can approach a nearly documentary style so that we can follow the actors. We wanted to give the actors as much freedom as possible to move around and to act in a very realistic and vivid way. If you would create a studio set that allows you to tell an entire story, you need to have flexibility in the movements, and you would like to have a perspective and angles that makes the story interesting. So we created a set that you can access from all sides, and you can move freely and continuously from one end to another, going through all the rooms. Working with Tim is always a challenge, and at the same time, it's the most wonderful thing an artist can ask for, because as precise he is about all the style and the way he wants to shoot, about realism, he would allow you a lot of creative freedom, and he's always open to all kind of suggestions. So, which means in this case, we had a long conversation about the must-haves and about how we want to approach the set and the story. And then I had a lot of time for myself to come up with a lookbook and a style guide that I thought would underline all these aspects and give us a great basis to work on. We all want to work as analog as possible. Everything should be done in front of camera instead of having it shifted to the post. I think this is a general approach that we all share. And when it comes to these screens, see, everything that the journalists are seeing and everything that the audience is seeing goes through these screens. Everything that happens outside of the studio needs to be filmed. Then they need to bring it into the studio. The material has to be developed, and then it comes to the screen. And then we see what happens. And this is an interaction between screens and the characters that is so important and crucial for the story. And if we would have had a green screen, or if we would have green screens all over the place, the acting in such an ensemble became really difficult. The sports team did an amazing job, but being in that position of telling a new story, I think they were pretty much overwhelmed and overloaded with so much responsibility and with such a drama that have been there. And we needed to create a rush, a pace, where no one really had the possibility to stop and to think about it. They were just high on adrenaline and just following the story. And I think that explains pretty well why the set was designed as we designed it. A set where you could walk from A to B without having a break and without realizing this is a studio set. So you were contained and you were locked inside that. I was under the impression that the actors could feel the set and they could really feel the claustrophobic structure that we created. After shooting day, I could really see it in their faces. They were exhausted. They were in the story. They were in the moment. And this is something, if I can witness this as a designer, it makes me very happy and proud. And I think the whole team could feel it. I really hope that the audience has not only learned something about history, but could also feel how it is to be in such a situation. Because we all are today, and every moment, in a kind of similar situation regarding the responsibility we have. And this was, for me, so appealing about doing this movie. Because we all have our mobiles at hand all the time, and we are witnessing things. And I can make a choice every second during my day if I want to capture something or not, and if I can send it or upload it to the internet or not. What is the purpose? What is my responsibility here? And I guess this is something that I always felt, but I never really thought about it before I did this movie. And I hope that the audience is taking this out of it, not only to be entertained and thrilled about that kind of story, and not only to get a new knowledge about that historical event, but also because they have felt the responsibility and what effect it has.
September 5 is a film about a group of individuals in 1972 who were unexpectedly faced with the task of covering a live breaking news event that ended up lasting for 22 hours. And they were not equipped to do that, in the sense that they were sports journalists that ended up covering a news event. And I think our film dives into the question of what sorts of decisions have to be made on the spot, what challenges are people faced in the wake of breaking news, and what decisions end up being made in the heat of the moment. The unique point of view of this particular film about that event is that it is about the journalists covering the event and not the event itself. And I loved the question it raised, because I think those questions have not lost any relevance. And this event is, quite a few decades ago. It was a 22-hour event unfolding with 900 million people watching live across the globe. We are in the room with the journalists making the decisions as to what footage do we show and how do we keep the show running. That is the question they are continuously asking, is not so much what do we show and the wider political aspect of it. Is more of a thing of how do we stay on air. I think what the film does tap into in terms of moral and ethical dilemmas is the question of showing violence. Keep in mind that when this happened in 1972, I don't know how much research had been done into the effects that seeing violence in the news, what that does to the viewership. I don't know where they stood back there. I imagine that it was nowhere near as much as information as we have today. So it kind of just happened. There was no time. It's not like there was a lot of room to ask themselves ethical questions about what should we show. The question was, how do we keep the show running? And yes, those questions did come up for the first time, but they were dealt with very quickly. John Magaro, the wonderful, wonderful John Magaro, who is one of the most dedicated people I've ever met in terms of, acting colleagues. He is serious about the acting. I mean, I think everyone is, but what I love about John is that he is a little grumpy and very, very stubborn and really, really good. Like it's again shockingly good. It's like that moment when you step on set and I was like, oh, I really need to deliver because everyone else is very good. You can't sit back and relax. And John plays, I haven't said this, Geoffrey Mason, who was at the time an up and coming sports journalist, and was supposed to cover the day, so talk about, you know, boxing, I think volleyball, so these kinds of things, and ends up having to run the room for 22 hours covering a terrorist attack. Ben Chaplin, my wonderful colleague, plays Marvin Bader, who in the film is like, I would say, is the journalistic conscience. So where we have Roone Arledge, who's all about keeping the show on air and viewership and visionary storytelling, Marvin Bader actually raises most of the very important questions about, do we show someone being shot on live TV, and what is our responsibility here? What people said about Marvin Bader, and that he was a bit grumpy but very loving and warm, and I think he captured that in his performance. What was remarkable was the attention to detail, I think, on the casting side. The supporting cast was incredible because they were there every day. They knew exactly what was happening, and it's very difficult to wait around in a room all day knowing that you don't even have a single word to say and you don't know if you're in frame. I think it's one of the hardest things to do. And I think it's kudos to Tim being very stubborn and relentless, but also to the group effort, because everyone understood that this can only work if we're acting as an ensemble. Whenever Tim said action, there was an electricity in the room, and I felt like I got to learn something from everyone. Like it's really exciting to be in that room. Lorenz Dangel has created a soundtrack that elevates the viewing experience, and I think the art of a good score is when it's there but you don't notice that it is doing something to you, and I think that is what Lorenz has achieved on this film, because it is subtle and it is dark, of course, but it's never overbearing and it's never telling you how to feel, and I think that's wonderful.
My name is Lorenz Dangel. I'm the composer of the music. When we watched the first cut, it was obvious that this film is so tense and is so in this narrow space. For me as an audio guy, it was really shocking. I mean, in opposite to the other films I made with Tim, there is no place, no space for any like, oh, great melody or something like atmospheric. Let's do a 2-minute arc of, you know, atmospheric well-being or whatever. So this just didn't happen. It was totally obvious that the audio track is so rich. You know, you have the dialogue, you have a lot of noises coming from the studio, you have speaker, walkie-talkie, telephones, a lot of sources. So I decided to choose a very direct, very dry, almost tactical kind of style in the music, and try to find sounds and instruments who provide these, you know, directness somehow. I created a lot of material. I mean, I went to the set one day, and when they stopped shooting, I went around inside the set and I recorded all these knobs from these old machines, because they're so great. You have these switches, and on these old machines, it's not like click, but it's like two things, like, or, you know, they all sound different. And I ran around and recorded all these little knobs and things. And Tim was still there on set after the shooting, and he was so fascinated and he loved it. And he ran around himself and said, "Lorenz, come over here, there's a nice switch." And I said, "Oh, wait a moment." And then I used some of it. You really have to pay attention when listening to the music, but some of it is still in my music. I produced some music which was mainly that synth stuff, because I wanted to show him the quality of an analog synth, because it's so different to anything you press on your keyboard with a soft synth. And he also reacted to that in a very positive way. He liked this bass, you know, this very present but still transparent bass sounds of these synths.
Hi, my name is Markus Förderer, and I'm the cinematographer on September 5. Working with Tim Fehlbaum is such a joy for me as a cinematographer. He's a very visual director. He started shooting documentaries himself, and he was a cameraman and a cinematographer on some of his short films in film school. So he has a great visual sensibility. And when I got the call to talk about September 5, like, it was, I think, 3 years actually before I started shooting. They were still writing, and we talked about ideas, and we went actually to the Olympic Village in Munich, which is like a historic site, so it's protected and looks pretty much like in the 70s. And we looked at it and talked about several different angles, how to tell that story, and the script evolved over time, but it was so helpful over the years to keep this conversation and think about it, especially since the film is so contained, and we don't see the outside world except for what our characters can see. We really were early on talking about how to give this film the scope and keep the audience engaged. We actually shot every scene in like a long oneer, so there was no breaks, no rehearsals. Like, we had the actors come in, and we captured it with 2 cameras. And I always told myself I was operating the camera as if I had only this one chance to capture it, as if it happens for real. So, for example, Peter Sarsgaard's character is like storming into the control room, I whip pan onto the TV screens, zooming in on seeing the masked man on the television, and panning to John McGarro's character as he like speaks into his walkie-talkie, zooming into an insert. So instead of traditionally we would set up a wide shot, then you cut, you reset, move the camera, put marks down for the actors, and relight. We didn't want this. We wanted to have this real-time sensation. And I think knowing from the beginning we would tighten it up in editing with like Hansjörg, this brilliant editor. I think there's all these connecting pieces which give it urgency, but then it's all tightened up, and so it feels like as if it's happening in real time. Both Tim and I, we loved the look of film. Like, we shot 16 back in film school, and we wanted this film to feel gritty and authentic, but we also were really fascinated by that look of all the archival footage from the time that we got. We didn't just want to replicate as if it was shot in the 70s. We wanted it to feel appropriate for the period, but still have something fresh. And I think we created quite a unique look with lighting and the lenses we chose. That feels like it takes place in the 70s, but it's still, we shot on high-resolution cameras. It is not like a low-res 60mm look. I think hopefully it brings the audience into that moment, so you feel like you experience it today. We had a great collaboration with all the departments. Like, speaking of costumes and production design, we looked at a lot of films from the time, and usually they were shot on film, obviously, and lit all with tungsten lights, so they usually tend to be very like yellow and warm. And I knew we wanted to make this film feel like it's part of the period, but we wanted it to also feel grounded and fresh. So for today's audience, it feels like immersive, as if it could happen today. So purposefully, we used some cooler colors in the lighting to contrast with some of the warmer colors that were used in costumes and set design. Like, especially, like, I think the walls we painted slightly warmer, and then we have like a cooler costume for like Jeff Mason's character, like played by John McGarro. And then I used cool lighting to counter this warmth in the room. So we all collaborated closely, and I always thought, like, we have to find something that's unique to our film. Like, I always like when a movie can pull it off, that you cannot just use a frame from this shot and mix it with another one. It has this distinct look, and that's why I think we were inspired by films of the 70s, but we didn't want it to look like it was shot in the 70s. This film is based on true events, right? It's a very serious story, but we always felt like, to do this justice, how it must have felt for people watching this live back then, we knew we had to really heighten the stakes and use all kinds of filmmaking techniques to make our audience watching this today feel like how it must have felt watching it back then. And so we used all kinds of techniques, like we used anamorphic lenses, and we used like a certain handheld style and modulated the light flicker to create that sensation and heightened tension. So we always thought, like, if this, whatever the film becomes, sometimes the film takes on a life of its own when you shoot it, you edit it, but like we always knew we wanted this to feel like a nail-biting thriller, because I think back then our characters didn't know, right? They couldn't just go online and see what's actually happening. They got pieces of information. They knew it happens right outdoor. They heard the shots fired, and also how their actions actually projected back into the real world and affected, like there was this police trying to storm the building and how they aborted that mission. It was amazing working with our composer, Lorenz Dangel. He's brilliant. I shot 3 films with Tim, and Lorenz was always the composer, so knowing his sensibility, and he showed us early a layout of some of the main theme he was planning. And I was surprised how quiet it is and how sensitive, and I could feel the quiet tension going on, and that really inspired me too. And knowing sometimes you have to go visually more bold and keep the music lower, or vice versa. Like if you're becoming very strong with a strong visual technique and heavy score, it might become too much. So this is like an interesting blend of introducing silence, almost near silence, and then a score slowly ramping up. And I did the same with my, visually with my images. I hope people will learn about the time, obviously, but in general, I think this is specifically about the Olympics '72 and that terrorist attack. But I think this goes in a broader sense for media and how we consume media today. This is just showing the process, and they mean the best. They're showing, like they're saying, we follow the story wherever it takes us. We're not gonna take any sides, but just by thinking twice or being aware when you consume something, watch something, think about it. There's always a choice being made by the people showing it, and even if we want it or not, sometimes there's no bad intention, but there is no such thing as an objective reality, and I think there is no easy answer to it.
Hi, my name is Moritz Binder, and I'm the writer of September 5. ABC Sports, they were really experts in how to broadcast live and how to cover events live as they unfold. And that day when they suddenly had to report on breaking news, they took all the experience they had in broadcasting live to broadcast news. And this changed the way news are covered to our day. I would say the research was two-parted. One part was the actual events that took place, and we wanted to be really precise in that out of respect. We read all the police files, we read books, we read scientific papers, everything on the events that took place. And then on the other side, we had biographies, scientific papers as well, and eyewitnesses on the ABC side, and on the bigger picture on the media side, what happened that day. And we tried to condense it into a 90-minute script. So in our movie, we follow 4 main characters through that day. The main character, I would say, is Geoffrey Mason. In our movie, a young producer who tries to impress his boss, Roone Arledge, who is a legend back then and a pioneer and someone who really want to impress. And Geoffrey, he stands for making things possible, thinking out of the box, trying to improvise, being smart and clever, not having the routine, but the cleverness to go in new ways. And this is the way he impresses Roone Arledge, who does that on another level, as a storyteller, exploring new ways in broadcasting sports, and then broadcasting news on that day. He's more the mastermind behind everything. And then we have Marvin Bader, who's like a friend of Geoffrey Mason and next to Roone Arledge, his superior. And he's more like, I would say, the reminder of this is not just about us. We have like a real responsibility for the people out there, for the families of the hostages. He doesn't want to stop the process. He wants his colleagues to start thinking about the echo chamber behind everything. Marianne Gebhardt is representing a whole new, back then, a whole new and young generation of Germans. I think I channeled my parents in her like a little bit because they were like born after the war and they were in her age that day. And everybody of that generation tried not to be defined by the atrocities committed by their parents or great parents. And they really tried to stand up and say, okay, I'm a new generation, we are in a new Germany, let's move on, let's move forward, let's try to be better. And this is, I think, what Marianne stands for. It was very important for us to be as accurate as possible, especially with the events taking place in the Olympic Village and the whole hostage situation. That, out of respect, we really wanted to get that as fact-based as possible. And on the ABC side, on the other side, we really wanted that the audience can feel how well researched it is, how the language, the jobs they are doing, like the technical aspect, the questions raised, the family-like structure. I mean, they're like really like a family trying to get through this. We tried to be as accurate as possible, and then we had to condense it to like 90 minutes because it took place over 22 hours, and then we had to take some liberties to condense it down to this 90-minute movie. Writing a script sometimes is a really dark process, like really scary, sitting alone at your desk. And working with Tim was the exact opposite. I mean, it was like always the two of us, always like together. And he accepted the way I work because I always have to write a scene really fast to feel it before overthinking it. And he embraced that. He said, okay, then give me that scene. And he's the master of condensing and rhythm. And he always condensed it down to its core. And that was a really great dynamic. And then when Alex David came on, based on the first drafts, that was a great moment because Alex is, with his like being so particular about words, about wording, about character arcs, that was a real great moment because, you know, we wrote a movie about teamwork and we wrote it as a team. And I think that kind of helped it.
It investigates how journalism has changed, I would say, from then until now, through the lens of the 1972 Olympics and the hostage crisis and the sports reporters who covered it. The tone of the film is a thriller, you know, and it's interesting because I think it's a thriller where a lot of people know the ending of the movie, at least I did, but for some reason it doesn't matter. When I first got the script, it was actually difficult for me to understand because some of it said that there's going to be documentary footage here, and you kind of had to imagine that. Some of the dialogue is very technical, and but it was really when I met Tim, and you know, he started talking about some of this footage that he had, this doc footage, and the way that he was going to cut it into the movie, and then I saw Jim McKay. And I realized that that was really our moment that we were leading toward, where he pronounces the fate of everyone involved. He really revolutionized what we know as like the Olympics broadcast that we all know and love, where there's a story, you get a background on someone, he covers the losers and the winners. Storytelling was really what I think Roone became known for. Also, when he started doing news after this, like with Dateline, it's really about the story. And I'm always a little suspicious of that kind of thing, because as a storyteller myself, I know that, you know, as a person who's told stories that were based off of real events, I know that sometimes the story becomes more important than the facts. You know, the conclusion that you want might be more important than the one that actually happened. Not that people change, or that Roone ever changed things that dramatically, but that the fact that his intention was storytelling is different than, to me, what news should be. Storytelling is perhaps really nice in sports, you know. Well, they had Peter Jennings. They had someone who knew something about news there, but they also had like Howard Cosell and Jim McKay and all these other guys trying to put in their 2 cents. They were just scrambling. They were just, you know, in a situation where they had to improvise. And I think Roone was probably right in wanting to wrest it away from news, because they were a million miles away. The decisions had to be made by the people on the ground, even though they were inexperienced. I'm not sure that news at that point would have known what to do with a live camera. And it would have been a first-time voyage for anyone. I read his book, I learned quite a bit about him, but I could disregard anything that didn't resonate with me, and really leaned into the things that made sense. And so yeah, I was just thinking about how if you're playing someone who's a real life person and they come to set, I've also had that happen. That's probably the worst case scenario. John Magaro, you know, plays Geoffrey Mason, who came in like he was just the kid who was on the night desk, and when the shots were fired and the decisions started having to be made, you know, he was the guy. And this was a real moment for him where he quite capably stepped into shoes that no one had ever been in. And, you know, if there was one person I did not envy on set, it was John Magaro, having to stand there with the, you know, the headset on and talking to Jim McKay, who's documentary stuff, and guys in the room in language that is very specific language to the people that are in these control rooms, calling out things. He always had like 6 things going on, which was kind of amazing. The main thing about all of these roles and the way that we interact in the film is, and it's really particular to this film, is there's no one who is it's a shared responsibility carrying the narrative of this movie between these actors. We are working as a single unit in the way that those people are. And I think that's pretty rare in films these days. A lot of the time you have, you know, the number 1 actor, and then it's like a pyramid down away from them. And that's really one of the main things that attracted me to doing the film, was the opportunity to be in a genuine ensemble. Bader is like, to me, he was the guy that was always coming up and worrying. He was the moral compass in some way to me. He was the guy who really thought of the, you know, the real conflicts, the real issues. And I obviously am somebody who was more interested in plowing ahead and doing whatever we had to do to cover this in the most complete way that we could and tell the story as it evolved. Leonie plays, we end up using her as a translator. She's and I would also say she becomes kind of because she's German, she becomes the German conscience of the film. Tim is really, really compulsive about detail, and he wanted everything to be pretty much as it was. We built it, the set got the same layout as the studio had. All of those monitors that are on the wall were showing real images from the Olympics. Most films would have those green screened, and we would add them later for ease of filming, because what if it's a different moment behind my head and all that sort of stuff. He really didn't concern himself that much with that. The more important thing to him was that we had a physical reality, and that really anchored all of us. We're in a very small room. There's actually 2 cameras usually going simultaneously. We have quite a bit of freedom as actors, so actors will sometimes be moving to slightly different places and getting picked up in different ways. And I think because you're in this small room, sometimes you don't have reference to where you are in the room. Oddly, it felt free to me. That said, you're ducking under cameras and stepping over cables, and it kind of made the ensemble even bigger. The ensemble included, you know, the guy operating the boom, and you know, the focus puller, and the cameraman, and everyone. We're all kind of doing it together. It was a little dance we had to work out for every scene. Oh no, we're now going to all pivot the other way, then I'll go under, then I'll come up. And I loved it. We would also shoot every scene basically from beginning to end. We didn't do pickup coverage. So you do it again, you do it again, you do it again. And I guess I really like acting, so I don't mind doing it again and again. The type of acting that we had to do had to be able to cut with Jim McKay talking, real world people. And so we had to have it be a particular kind of acting. Not all kinds of acting has to be like this, but it just had to have a real authenticity to it. One of the main things that helped us with that authenticity was the fact that if you flipped the switch like that, the light went off. Or you went like this and the TV went off. Or you went like that and the fax worked. Or the reels, right? It just grounds you in reality. It would have been, you know, actors like to act, and sometimes I would actually say actors like to show off. We all do. And that will kind of lead you away from reality. Being in a type group like this where there's really not a lot of grandstanding moments, you know, it's all a real shared experience with these real machines and everything. I think it just was the only way of doing it. I guess first of all, I hope that they are carried along by the thriller aspect of the movie. But I think where it leaves you in the end is asking some of these questions I was just talking about, like who gets to tell the story? And does news need to be a story?
I watched the Olympics all that summer and watched what happened. I don't think I would have known at the time to connect the questions about the media's role in the coverage of it. And when I read the script, of course, it made sense and it all came together. And I felt that that was something that was not only of its time, but has become increasingly more timely and reflective of what's happening in the media today. Well, he's clear-minded, but he's cinematically clear-minded. I mean, clear-mindedness is always appealing when someone can talk about their perspective through cinema in a way that gives you great confidence that they are indeed a storyteller.
Geoffrey's been an incredible collaborator since the earliest days, and in fact, you know, research and interviewing Geoffrey sort of shifted the scope of the script into the very narrow lane that it lands. You know, as one of the only people still with us today who was in the room, who was there on the ground as a producer facing all of these really tough questions, I think that the movie asks. He was an invaluable resource to us, and you know, as bright as ever, and a legend in his own right. There have been other movies and projects that kind of touched on this part of history, but this one's very singular in that it puts us right inside the room of this impossible situation where you had sports broadcasters who were there with all the tools to tell the story live of the Olympics, you know, for the first time around the world, and suddenly found themselves, you know, they're excited to report on Mark Spitz, for instance, winning a 7th gold medal, and suddenly the next day we're pivoting toward covering, you know, a terrorist attack. It was a wild moment in history and one that, you know, I don't think anyone could have foreseen, but it's riveting to watch these sports broadcasters kind of navigate this almost impossible situation and come out on the other end of it.
when there's electricity in an ensemble, when when each one of them is not only hitting that big mark, but the great assist plays and that collaborative energy that was going on with the actors with the director, with the cinematographer, it's just, it's gold. And I'm a big fan of all these actors, and I was really thrilled that we were able to get them.
That's an incredible moment in the film. It's sort of where you have the heart, the brain, and the muscle kind of all coming together and trying to figure out how to work together. Roone sort of being the brain, the one masterminding this whole operation, and Jeff being, the muscle making things move it. And then you have, Marvin step in as the heart of them and questioning the brain and the muscle. Are the things that we're doing here in tandem actually the right things that we should be doing?
There's an immediacy in this subject in a lot of ways. And I think one of the things that I hope is that it will increase the layers in which people are willing to look at things and to understand that that things are not black and white, that there's the horror and the beauty of mankind in this thing, and that balance of the excellence of sports, the dedication, the amount of their lives from being very young committed to this or committed to journalism. I would hope that this could be looked at as one part of the story, a very important part of the story, but that it would encourage that we all keep looking for more parts.
I'm Philipp Trauer.
I'm Thomas Wöbke.
And we're the producers of the movie September 5. September 5 is a film about an American sports television crew that were actually covering the 1972 Olympics in Munich, and they had to switch from sports broadcasting to news broadcasting on the day of when the crisis happened, just in front of their studio complex. And so I think it's a movie about journalistic responsibilities and questions that just came up, and about like first time that something like that happened. And yeah.
The interesting thing is that in 1972 at the Munich Olympics, it was the first time they had this commercial idea broadcasting it all over the world via satellite, and they also sold the rights, the IOC, to different TV channels over the world, and ABC won this battle to get the rights to broadcast for North America.
I think it's maybe a special collaboration, because we're really like a family, especially like Tim, Thomas and me, we're like, the three of us. So it was also us together coming up with the basic idea to make a movie about that specific day and the events on that day.
When we had this idea, it was in November, I think 2020, and there were all these articles about the commemoration day in 2022 for the 50th anniversary of this day. And there was still the discussion, because the German government never excused themselves for this whole thing to the Israeli people or families. And this also because we are from Munich, we live there. Our office is just like 1,000 meters away, also from the whole thing. When we really looked for a new project for Tim and be together, we had this idea, and because also it was said that there will be new things coming out, in the archives. They are opening their files, and so we were excited to find something new, because there are still some mysteries about this day, what happened there.
Tim is an amazing director when it especially comes to visuals and to a physical experience. I think that's really something that he's so capable of. And I mean, he showed with his first film that Thomas produced, Hell, it was such a vision in there, and with such a limited budget, and with his first film, it's insane, like what they have done. And then his second, The Colony, which is a sci-fi, and it's also there. You really feel what the protagonist is feeling, you know, and I think going with this package of tools and approaching this story in September 5, that's why the film is what it is now. That's why it is a thriller, and that's why it's so engaging and so, yeah, just thrilling experience. It's because of that, because he creates this momentum when he shoots the movie, and I think that's something that the actors can best underline and tell, is he really creates this momentum where, yeah, I don't know, where this physical experience happens. I think we were really lucky to have our German casting director, Simone Baer. She was there, she brought Leonie Benesch right in the beginning to the project. Then we had Nancy Foy, our American casting director. She helped us get all these, I mean, you know, the movie is about an ensemble. Like, we needed this outstanding ensemble. They have to be great at their own, but also work together very well. And Nancy was amazing in finding and suggesting us the right people. And then we were really lucky to get Protected Picture Works on board the company with Sean Penn and John Arapalma and John Wildermuth, and they really, with their help in the end, it was much easier for us as a small production company from reaching out from Munich, you know, to get access to these actors that Nancy set up, and yeah, I think it was just the whole combination when we got all of these great consultants to us together that we were able to accomplish this cast. Moritz, our writer who wrote the script together with Tim, they did such an amazing job together, and we had a script from the first version of the script until the shooting draft. It only got better and better and better, and I think we started the shooting process with the script that was in such a good place. And I think that's the basis, you know, for the editing. They need to have a working script, and then of course the footage has to be great. Hansjörg, he really pulled it off. I mean, it was so hard for him also because Tim and Markus, they have this thing called wild style. They shoot all directions all the time. Like they they don't stop running. Like so it was a huge amount of footage that they created, and Hansjörg had to, yeah, I don't know, bring a direction into it, and he really did an amazing job on that.
Yeah, I know Hansjörg for a very long time. I did many films with him together, but not in the last 10 years. So I was so happy to have him on board, because I knew that he would be a great combination with us, and because he's also like Markus and Julian and Tim and us and John Palmer and John Wildermuth. We are just really diving very deep into it, and Moritz as well. And it was just, you know, the last element which was missing, and yeah, this collaboration was really, really great. And he's fast. Hansjörg is very fast, and that we love.
I hope that the audience, when they watch our movie, first of all, are entertained. I think that first of all, it's an entertaining and a gripping movie, and so that's the first thing that I hope. And then I think I would wish for the audience to talk about the movie afterwards, and to think about the questions that the movie raises, and to discuss it, and also to make the transfer to our today's time, and how news and are created, and journalism works today. Yeah.
And then of course that they can get an insight to have to watching and to learn how journalism is working, till today.
In September 5, we tell the true story of the tragic events of that day in '72 in Munich, told from a very specific perspective. It's the story of a television crew, sports television crew of ABC Sports that had to make the switch from sports to news on that day. I was immediately intrigued by this concept for two reasons. One is from a filmmaker's point of view. I thought I found the challenge interesting to tell a story that more or less takes place in one room, in the studio, with the monitors being the only window to the outside world, to what's happening actually really close to them. And the other thing was that as someone who's working in the media myself, I thought that I felt much more connected to tell something about the media on that day, the role of the media. The interesting thing about the case of '72 in Munich is that maybe compared to, let's say, classical newsroom drama, these were not experienced or trained journalists to report on a subject like this. These were actually sports reporters. And this we found very interesting because it would offer the opportunity to, let's say, in a way they had almost an innocent view on what was happening. And suddenly these people that were used to report on sporting events were confronted with questions like, can we show violence on TV? And what we try to do with the movie, we try to raise these questions, but we don't want to give clear answers. Because actually I think to a lot of these questions there are no clear answers. I at least wouldn't know the answer. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to make a movie about the complexity, but also the importance of reporting on a crisis situation, told in this case from a very specific point of view, from a bunch of sports TV people that suddenly had to make the switch from sports to news. First of all, we have Geoffrey Mason, who is the character played by John Magaro. And we based Geoffrey Mason on the real Geoffrey Mason. The real Geoffrey Mason being the main source for us, the eyewitness that we could talk to, who was there during this 22 hours of broadcasting on this tragic situation. Then we have his mentor, Marvin Bader, the character played by Ben Chaplin, who is, I would say, the heart and soul of the group. Let's say the moral compass. And then we have Roone Arledge, played by Peter Sarsgaard, the head of ABC Sports, who very early on realized that this broadcast might change a lot of their careers. And then we have the character of Marianne Gebhardt, played by Leonie Benesch, and she's the translator of the group, at least at the starting point of the movie. And I think in a movie that is a lot about communication, about also communication between nations, also about miscommunication, a translator is a very important role. Even more importantly, she represents the new Germany of that time, the new generation that tried to free themselves for what the previous generation did. I wanted to have the studio as claustrophobic as possible because we saw in these original plans it was really tight. So for example, what we didn't want to have is moving walls. Usually in these sets you have moving walls so that you can position the camera a little bit more comfortable. And I didn't want to have that. I wanted to have the opposite. I wanted to have this claustrophobic feeling. And the idea of the DP, Markus Förderer, and we discussed that we want to shoot it as if we ourselves would be a documentary crew or a broadcast team in that room, observing those people, observing the monitors. Sometimes I had really long takes that we just covered with the cameras. This led to a lot of material, and I think that editor Hansjörg Weißbrich was crucial on shaping then the film in the editing. And he was essential in finding the right tone for the movie. I like working with Markus so much, and I'm sure this is also the reason why his producers love to work with him, is he always thinks from the story, you know? It's never about him getting the best setup or so. It's always about what helps really the actors and what helps the story. For example, something that I found really amazing is that he had a very clever concept on how to light everything from the ceiling so that we could freely move around with the cameras. And if Tom McGarr wanted to go suddenly from there to there, we could follow him, and the setup Markus did was so perfectly planned that we could just 360 degrees pan around with the cameras and capture that energy. The movie, although it is more than 50 years ago that this happened, it feels very relevant for today, because while the technology might be a different one today, these moral questions are still the same. And while maybe today everyone has a camera and a TV in their pocket, it is interesting to take a step back and look at how that was for the first time covered in live television. So I think ideally we want to raise some questions. To a lot of these questions I wouldn't know the answer myself, but ideally the audience walks out of the movie and would talk about and think about how we consume media today.